Hi everybody, welcome back. So this is part 2 of your week 3 lesson in community psychology. So where we left off in part 1 was we ended off with the social climate model. So where we're going to pick back up right now is looking at the behavior settings model, which is a part of ecological psychology that you can read a little bit more about in your textbook. Basically, so this model is a little bit interesting and different than the social climate model. Rather than being interested in the specific people who participate in a different environment, the behavior settings and ecological psychology model is really interested in the behaviors that are associated with a specific setting. So not in the individual people per se, but in the patterns of behavior that are associated with that particular setting. So if you were to look at a classroom, for example, or how somebody participates in a grocery store or a certain workplace, for example, we know that there are certain kinds of settings where you can switch out all the people and replace them with totally brand new ones. And we know, generally speaking, that people will behave the same. So we're interested in the kinds of rules that maintain certain behavior patterns. So again, think about someone's behaviors in a place like a school, right? We have a classroom here. We know that if we are entering into a classroom, if we are a student, we walk into the classroom, we take a seat, we maybe pull out our notebook and our pen and get ready to have a lesson, right? That's what we do in class. So we know that there are these certain places in our world that are associated with certain kinds of behaviors. And that's a really interesting way for us to think about how a setting would impact the people who participate in that setting. Basically, what the behavior settings model is all about is it's a way for us to evaluate how a certain setting, again, might impact the people who participate in that setting based on the actual behaviors that are associated with that setting itself. Are these behaviors that are stressful? Are these behaviors that are fairly benign, don't really rattle people one way or another? Do people engage in collegial, respectful, collaborative kinds of behaviors in these environments? That kind of thing. So just some interesting things for us to consider there. The third model that we're going to look at is environmental psychology, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on this approach. So this is a whole other type of psychology that you can take a course in here at Fanshawe College. And we borrow a little bit from environmental psychology when we're trying to understand how a setting or community climate rather, would impact the people who participate in it. Because environmental psychology is very concerned with the influence of physical characteristics of a setting on people's well-being and behaviors. So it usually focuses on things like the built environment, right? A built environment would be sort of your artificial manufactured environment that we human beings have created in one way or another. And we know that there are built environments like buildings or houses, for example, that people generally enjoy more than others. And so what environmental psychology is interested in is trying to figure out what is it about certain settings, what are about the physical characteristics of certain settings that make people feel better than others? Environmental psychology is very concerned with something called an environmental stressor. So an environmental stressor is going to be something like excessive noise, air pollution, hazardous waste. If you live in an environment with crowded housing, for example, these are all going to be things that very negatively impact a person's experience of that environment or setting. For example, a couple years ago, we had construction going on in my neighborhood. And there were days where my whole house would shake, like the walls would shake, everything would shake. I couldn't get anything done. I couldn't get any work done. It drove me batty. And I remember I had to leave the house while the construction workers were doing their thing. And I had to set up shop in a Tim Hortons for like a month to get my work done. Because as a professor, we do work quite a bit from home. To do our class prep and our marking and, stuff like that. So something like that has a really big impact of someone's experience of their environment. And that's something that we use to understand that. So a couple examples of some extreme environmental stressors. So these are two historical examples that took place in the 1900s in the United States. And basically, we know that they really impacted people's experience of their homes for people who lived near these two locations. So the Love Canal was a location in New York State, I believe, where basically they determined in the 1970s that there was this terrible chemical waste dump. And some companies had been dumping very, very toxic chemical waste. This is an image here from the Love Canal area. And a whole bunch of people just had to vacate their homes. They had very significant health impacts from the toxic waste that had been dumped near their homes. Cancer levels were very, very high for people who lived in this area. So some really, really terrible impacts. 3 Mile Island was in Pennsylvania, I believe, yeah. And basically there was a really serious nuclear accident that occurred at a nuclear power plant. And again, the radiation associated with that nuclear accident, it very, very significantly impacted the community that lived close to that nuclear power plant. So we know that in extreme situations like this, these kinds of environmental stressors can have a huge impact on how an individual would experience the community in which they lived. So environmental psychology, it helps us really to understand aspects about the physical environment itself. Things like environmental design these are other topics that environmental psychology is interested in. Looking at architectural and neighborhood design features. Do you live in a neighborhood with access to green space, for example? And so I show students these two pictures here and I kind of say, which neighborhood would you rather live in, right? The neighborhood with the nice park or the neighborhood with the dilapidated building that's falling down, that is in disrepair, isn't being maintained. We see that when people live in a neighborhood that looks a little bit more like this, that it has a huge impact on their mental health and well-being. People don't feel the same sense of ownership, trust in one another, things like that. They don't feel as safe. Big, big impacts on people's well-being. We're interested in community psychology in neighborhoods and risk factors. So these are areas of concern for environmental psychology as well, and how a neighborhood would affect the people who live in them. Now, the two kinds of risk factors that you're seeing here at the bottom of this slide, distal and proximal risk factors. So a distal risk factor would be a risk factor that's a little bit broader in scope, would affect someone a little less directly or immediately. So what we know is that neighborhoods with lower incomes in general, neighborhoods that look a little more like this, right, that people who come from these neighborhoods generally have higher rates of mental health issues, that delinquency and crime rates are higher in these kinds of neighborhoods. Even something as striking as cardiovascular disease, right? Heart and lung disease. These things are higher in neighborhoods with lower income. So we're really concerned with these kinds of issues, right? Because these should, generally speaking, be preventable issues. Now, we also have proximal risk factors. If a risk factor is more proximal, it is more immediate or acute. It's felt more directly. So again, looking at a lower income neighborhood, what we see is that these are neighborhoods that are more likely to be exposed to polluted air and water. Again, a lower income neighborhood might be closer to a highway, a freeway, train tracks, things like that, right? Where we know that environmental hazards and spills happen a little bit more frequently. We see that these neighborhoods generally have less access to healthy food. Grocery stores are a little bit further away in these kinds of neighborhoods. And we see that things like convenience stores are generally more prevalent in a lower income neighborhood. And a convenience store would usually not have the kinds of healthy food that a grocery store would have access to. Now, again, we know the relationship between academic achievement in kids and a good, healthy diet. So again, just the impacts of all of these things, they just kind of pile up and pile up and pile up, and the risk factors build and build and build to the point where we have a community that is not functioning well, that is not healthy, and needs some help or intervention. Now, this term here, incivility, an incivility is a term that is used in environmental psychology to refer to a noticeable sign of a neighborhood disruption that essentially will raise people's fear of crime. Now, incivilities can be both physical or social. So a physical incivility is going to be something like a broken window, litter, graffiti, things like that. Social incivility is going to be when people know about crimes that have taken place, if people feel socially isolated from their neighbors, that they can't trust them, for example. And again, research in environmental psychology has shown time and time again that neighborhoods with higher levels of incivilities, also associated with lower income neighborhoods, have higher levels of depression, anxiety. People are afraid that crime is going to happen because crime does happen more often in these kinds of neighborhoods. And this affects people's health. It affects their relationships. It affects how they use community resources, right? Are you going to be likely to go to the library, if you don't feel safe walking down the street? No, of course you're not, right? So these kinds of things really do affect people. We also know that there are really some amazing protective processes that can help people, like social ties and sense of community and feeling safe, that lower income communities with stronger social ties do better, right? And they have lower rates of child abuse and things like this, right? So there are some amazing protective processes that can help people. So, quick review of Chapter 5. We looked at 3 different models for understanding how an individual person is affected by the climate in which they live, the community in which they live. So we talked about the social climate model and the 3 dimensions: personal growth, relationships, and system maintenance and change. We then looked at the behavior settings associated with ecological psychology. And last, we looked at some important concepts that environmental psychology uses to understand how people are affected by the communities in which they live. So this is going to be the end of your Chapter 5 lesson. We will pick back up in Part 3 on your Chapter 6 lesson. Thanks very much, guys.